Hi, everyone. Okay, so we've talked about the different structures inside of cells. And I told you that there would be one particular organelle that we would spend a good amount of time talking about, and that was the cell membrane. And we're going to turn our attention to that now. Now, remember that cell membrane controls what goes in and out of the cell. It's semi-permeable. It lets some things through and not others, right? And so this section of the chapter, we're going to talk about how materials or what materials will move across the membrane and what will get them across, and how the cell makes that happen. Before we talk about a cell, I want to use an example that has nothing to do with the cell at all. I want you to imagine that I've got a bottle of perfume right here, and I open the bottle of perfume. Okay, now someone on the other side of the room is not going to be able to smell that perfume right away, right? But after some time, maybe an hour, right? They'll get that little scent over on the way on the other side of the room. They'll get that kind of scent, a little bit of it. And they'll be like, I smell perfume, right? So what is happening? I can open a bottle of perfume on one side of the room, and eventually people smell it on the other side of the room. Well, it turns out that perfume is a liquid, right? In the bottle, you've got a liquid, and it has a very low evaporation point, and it evaporates into a gas, and you end up with gas molecules, or molecules in gas form, floating around and bumping around, and eventually get to the other side of the room, right? And it is inside your nose, you have these receptors that when the molecule of perfume hits them, it sends a message to your brain. You're like, wow, that's perfume, right? So that's, your nose is actually just a sensor for gas molecules. And smell is just your sensing of gas molecules. So we have these perfume molecules that are floating around, and they bounce into your nose and you smell it. And when you first open the bottle, only you smell it real close. But somebody way on the other side of the room isn't going to smell it until later. And what's happening is that these molecules are bouncing around and eventually move from one side of the room to the other. And here's the crazy thing. You don't need a fan. You don't need anybody to go. The room can be absolutely still. No movement of air at all. And the molecules will still get there. It's almost like magic. It's a lot like gravity. You don't have to push things down toward the ground. They move, and you don't have to push them. Just like molecules will go from where there's a whole lot of them and spread out to where there's very few. And you don't need to do anything. You don't need a fan. You don't need anything to make them go. Just like you don't need anything to make a pen fall toward the ground. It's different force here, okay? But it's the same idea. You don't need to do anything. Your cells don't need to do anything. If there's a very high concentration of molecules in the perfume bottle and a very low concentration of molecules far away, they will move, just like a rock will roll down the hill, okay? And that's going to be a really important idea for transport in the cell. What I'm saying is that to get the molecules to move, it requires no energy. We call that passive transport. It moves materials without any input of energy. The cell doesn't have to do anything. It will happen whether the cell wants it to or not. If you have a really high concentration in one place and a very low concentration in another, the molecules will move from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. It's called passive transport. Passive because it happens to the cell, whether the cell likes it or not. It might not want it to happen, but it's going to. If you've got a high concentration in one place and a low concentration in another, those molecules will move just as surely as a rock will roll down a hill. Okay. Now, there is also the possibility of moving the molecules from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So imagine I go back to our bottle of perfume, and we have these molecules that spread out all over the room. Do you think that the molecules will just instantaneously on their own go back into the bottle? Can you imagine getting all those molecules back into the bottle? Not going to happen without a great deal of energy. It's going to take a lot of energy to collect them all up and You'd need some kind of machine, and you'd need to filter the air, and you'd need to shove them back in. Lots and lots of energy to get it to go from where there's a lower concentration to where there's a higher concentration. If a cell desperately wanted to do that, they would have to do what's called active transport. Makes sense it's called active because it takes a lot of energy. And that's whenever the cell is moving things from where there's a very low concentration to where there's a very high concentration. All right, so let's take a look and see if we understand when passive and active transport will happen. Okay, so let's imagine this is a cell and there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the cell and a very low concentration of carbon dioxide out the cell. There's a high concentration of oxygen outside the cell and a low concentration of oxygen inside the cell. So what's going to happen to the carbon dioxide? Assuming that the membrane is permeable to carbon dioxide, it should go from where there's a high concentration to where there's a low concentration, and it should go by passive transport out or diffuse out. And what will happen to the oxygen? Well, there's a high concentration of oxygen out here and a low concentration here, so it should go in. It doesn't matter how crowded it is in here. It doesn't matter how many water molecules or carbon dioxide molecules. If there's a higher concentration of oxygen here than here, it is going to go in by passive transport, also called diffusion. Oops. Okay, so those oxygen molecules will diffuse in, the carbon dioxide molecules will diffuse out. The cell has no say over this. It doesn't get to decide. It will just happen as surely as a pen falling down toward the earth or a rock rolling down the hill. Okay, now let's say the cell wants to keep the carbon dioxide inside and it's flowing out. Well, then it's going to have to pump it back in. It's going to have to go from low to high. That would be active transport. Or let's say it wants to keep the oxygen outside and it's flowing in. It will have to pump it out. That's active transport. So if the cell wants to keep oxygen out, it has to pump it out from low concentration to high concentration because it will diffuse from high to low. And the carbon dioxide is diffusing from high to low. So if the cell wants it in there, it's going to have to pump it back in by active transport. Let's try another example. Here I have an amoeba living in the water. Let's say that the lake that it lives in is 95% water. It's got salts and other things dissolved in it. And the more salts there are, the more it brings that concentration down. So let's say that there's 5% salts and that makes it 95% water. And let's say our amoeba has 90% water inside of it. Which way will water tend to go? Will it diffuse in or will it diffuse out? Well, there's a higher concentration of water here and lower here, so the water should diffuse in. Now, what's going to happen to our amoeba if the water diffuses in? It's going to explode. So that amoeba has to have a mechanism for pumping water out. And it does. It's got something called a contractile vacuole that pumps the water out. You can think of this poor amoeba, and these amoebas do. They live in this situation where water's flowing into their bodies all the time and they have to pump it out. You can think of it like a leaky boat. You've ever been in a leaky boat? You got a little hole, right? And the water just seeps in and it's just gonna keep coming in. You're paddling your boat, rowing your boat, whatever it is you're doing, right? And the water's coming in. Well, what are you gonna do? You're gonna get a bucket and you're gonna bail, right? And anybody that's bailed a leaky boat will tell you that's a lot of energy. It takes a lot of work. The water keeps diffusing in. It's not really the same mechanism in the boat, but it's a very good analogy. The water is just going to keep coming in. Here, the water's just diffusing in, right? And this amoeba is going to have to bail the water out its whole life. Bail, bail, bail. Lots of work to get it to go from low concentration to high concentration. All right, so passive transport that doesn't require energy is a movement of materials from an area of high concentration to low concentration. The process is called diffusion. It's passive transport called diffusion. And it depends on something called a concentration gradient, where there's a higher concentration of molecules in one place than the other. And when that exists, you're going to get diffusion. You're going to get molecule A to diffuse over here. And here we have a higher concentration of B's here than here, and B's should diffuse over. There's a gradient. There's a high and a low, a gradient. So we're going to have the A's diffuse to the right and the B's diffuse to the left. At some point, you're going to have equal amounts of A's and B's on both sides, right? And you're going to have equilibrium. So for example, you're going to have the A's, and I'm going to move myself out of the way a little bit there. We're going to have the A's, right, that we said we're diffusing to the right, and the B's we're diffusing to the left. Eventually, you're going to have an equal number of A's here and here. We say that equilibrium has been reached. Here, there's still a concentration gradient, a high and a low. Here, we're at equilibrium. There is no concentration gradient anymore. And that's where we're going to take a break for today. On the next video, we'll talk about the diffusion of a particular molecule, water, and that's called osmosis. So to recap, we have two types of transport. That which goes from high to low is passive, including diffusion. That which goes from low to high requires lots of energy, and it's called active transport.